All right, Reynolda, are you ready for some good news?
Yes.
God leaves no doubt that Jesus is King. A King you can believe in, a King who promises you are not alone in your waiting. I've been thinking this week a lot about the disappointment of the day after. We watch a lot of Christmas movies at our house, and I was watching Elf with our kids, and there's a scene there where they've spent the whole year preparing for Christmas, and then Santa Claus walks in and says, "Yay, it was a great year. Now let's start getting ready for next year," right? And they reset the timer, and they all get started on doing the new work. Christmas works like that a little bit. You spend months getting ready for that morning, for that opportunity to be with family during the week. And then in a few instances, the floor's covered in wrapping paper, your kids have scattered, the family has scattered, and all the attention moves to whatever's next. There are other things in our lives that work that way, right? There are other things like the counting down for vacation. There's this weird thing that happens where you'll count down for the first day of vacation, but by the third day of vacation, you already slip into the dread of, oh no, it's 3 days, it's 2 days, it's 1 day till we have to go back to work. And then you start counting down to the next time that you get a vacation. See, here's the deal. Things aren't always what they seem. Things aren't always what they seem. A couple weeks before Christmas, my wife had spent an enormous amount of time baking goodies and breads and putting together baskets for our friends and family, and then she delivered them to our friends and family. And then later that evening, I started getting texts from people saying, "What kind of cookie was that she made?" I was like, I had nothing to do with this. I have no idea what you're even talking about. This one guy said, "Well, I took a bite of it, and my throat's been burning for an hour." I was like, well, maybe she put too much nutmeg in it, or maybe, I don't know. And so then another person texts me and says, "What kind of cookie was that? Like, something doesn't seem right. What were the ingredients? Maybe I'm allergic to that cookie." And so finally, after the third person that evening texted me, I texted my wife and said, "What kind of cookie is this?" And she said, "Well, it's not a cookie at all. That's the soap your daughter made, and I put it in the bag." Had one person who said, "I've brushed my teeth multiple times, and there's still suds coming out of my mouth." Another person said, "It burnt my throat so bad, I thought I had to go to the emergency room." Now, in our defense, it didn't look like the cookies. In their defense, it did come in the same bag that the cookies came in. Sometimes things aren't what they seem. Today, we're going to look, as we conclude our Advent series, at Luke chapter 2. I'm going to read a big chunk of this. I'm going to pick up in verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him, and he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people. He inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it was written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." When Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had been seen when it rose went from them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Verse 10. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down before him and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Verse 13. Now when they departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and he took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill the prophecy, what the Lord has spoken by the prophet. "Out of Egypt I called my son." Verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all of the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region when 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because there are no more. Verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream in Egypt, saying, "Rise and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and he lived in the city called Nazareth. That was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. Every gospel presents a very particular portrait of who Jesus is. Matthew's gospel is very interested in presenting Jesus as King of the Jews. Today, as we end our series in Advent, I want to look particularly at the ways in which Matthew ties his understanding of who Jesus is to Jesus being the Jewish king. In chapter 1 of Matthew, we see this long genealogy. And let's be honest, when we're doing our through the year in the Bible reading plans, we skip the book of Lamentations, we skip, parts of the Old Testament, and then we skip these genealogies because we don't know anything about these people. There's only like 4 of them that we even know their names. And so we skip these pieces. But both Matthew and another gospel include these because they're tying Jesus back to the genealogy. Jesus had to both be connected to the line of David, but also not inherit original sin. And so the way the Lord accomplishes this is that he connects Jesus to the royal line in Matthew's genealogy, and then Jesus is able to skip over original sin by being born of a virgin. In the beginning of chapter 2, we see that Jesus is not only king, but he is loved. These magi, these wise men from the Orient, they come and they worship him and they bring gifts to him. And at the end of chapter 2, we see that Jesus is hated. King Herod hated Jesus because he had come to take Herod's place. Herod had no right to reign in Jerusalem. He wasn't even a Jew. He was an Edomite. And so you see that Jesus' genealogy, his connection to the royal line, is essential to understanding who he is. Matthew wants the reader to clearly understand that Jesus is the rightful king of Israel. He's not just the Savior of the world, that would be sufficient, but he is the rightful heir to David's throne. And as proof of Jesus' kingship, Matthew points to Old Testament prophecies about Jesus. There are approximately 320 Old Testament prophecies. These 320 Old Testament prophecies had to be fulfilled by one single person for any single person to claim that they were the Messiah. And so if you're a skeptic here today and you don't believe yet that Jesus is king, just let me say that Jesus fulfills all 320. And what's the likelihood that a person could just by chance fulfill 320 prophecies that have geographical distinctions and hereditary distinctions and training distinctions and being born of a virgin distinctions? What's the likelihood? Well, honestly, we don't have any way to comprehend the complexity of what the odds are that one person in human history could fulfill these 320. So we like to always use a subset, which is what Matthew's doing here. Matthew's taking a subset of these prophecies and saying, hey, I just want you to look at these 4. But let's take a bigger number than that. Let's take a number like 8. What's the likelihood that one single person in human history could just fulfill 8 of these random prophecies? And I want you to go back to high school algebra class where you swore you were never going to use it again, and here you are all these years later using it in church. So who knew, right? And I want you to think about the way scientific notation works. Scientific notation is a way of taking a very complex long number and write it in a simple form. Let's take something that we all understand the pain of, like the national debt. The national debt. So the national debt, this was last night. This was a live read of how much our government owes. $36 trillion. So if you're going to write this in scientific notation, you would write it 3.6 times 10 to the 14th power. That's how you would write the national debt in a way that wouldn't just be humiliating to you about how much money your government owes, right? So let's take something like the probability that one person in human history could fulfill just 8 prophecies about the coming Messiah. What would that number be in scientific notation? It would be 1 times 10 to the 28th power. So a number twice as long as the national debt. That's the likelihood that just one person in human history could fulfill just 8 of these random prophecies. So Matthew understands that the prophecies about Jesus, the 320, are going to be essential to validating the claim that he's making about Jesus. And of those 320, 4 of them are distinctly connected to geographical locations. Now, if you know anything about me, you know I know nothing about geography. If we were playing that game where like you said, hey, you have 10 minutes to write down all 50 states, I'm good to about 23 or 24, and then I have no idea. Once you get past Kentucky and show back up in California, I have no idea what's in the middle. It all looks the same, right? I couldn't do the Pillsbury Doughboy that's in the middle where you're supposed to know all that. I don't know any of these states. But I know that there are 4 geographical locations that are connected to Jesus being the rightful king. And it picks up in verse 4. And assembling the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired to them, where will this Christ be born? And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So the first geographical location that if Jesus was going to be the rightful heir to the throne of David, the rightful king of Israel, he had to be from Bethlehem. And so how is that possible? How is it possible that Jesus is from Bethlehem? Herod is upset that these magi have come. We have turned these magi, I've talked to you about this before, into these kind of 3 chunky guys who walk through the desert at night wearing funky outfits and bringing random gifts. But in fact, throughout human history, the magi, the magicians, were from the Orient. They were from Babylon, and they were kingmakers. We see them actually in the story of Daniel. They actually traveled with their own army. There were a multitude of them that would go from city to city. And as Babylon grew in its influence, these magi, these magicians, were the ones that would go and anoint the king of the region. And so when these magi show up to Jesus's manger, what we see is that story, as we've been told, isn't exactly right. First of all, they don't show up at the manger. They show up at the house a couple months later because word has arrived to them that there is a new baby in Israel that's being called the King of the Jews. So they travel with their army to the land where Jesus has been born in Bethlehem to anoint him as king. And they bring royal gifts to affirm and to confirm that he is the rightful king of Israel. And so Herod understands that these are not 3 dumpy guys traveling with camels who randomly show up. He understands that the royal kingmakers from the Orient have come. And if they're going to anoint a new king of the Jews, there's going to be a problem for the old king of the Jews, who is Herod. Herod the Edomite, who had no business sitting on the throne of David, who'd been placed there by Rome, was about to be replaced. And it says that this person will be from Bethlehem. Nothing significant about Bethlehem. You can only name 2 people in human history who even came from there. It's one of 1,000 different cities that dot the hillsides around Jerusalem. The reason we know about it is because 2 of the most significant people in human history came from there. David and Jesus. So the first thing is that this person who will be the rightful heir to David's throne had to come from this insignificant city of Bethlehem, just one of 1,000 random small cities. The second piece we pick up in verse 13. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." He arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So these magi, these magicians, these kingmakers from the Orient, they arrive, and immediately we've got to protect baby Jesus. And so he tells them through a dream, the Lord does, to go to Egypt. And so it uses this phrase, which only shows up twice in the whole New Testament, this phrase that means to flee from danger. This is the first occurrence when the angel of the Lord comes to Joseph and Mary and tells them to flee from danger. The second time that it's used is actually a word that comes to Jesus and tells Jesus to flee from danger after John the Baptist has been beheaded. And so this is a word that includes some urgency. It's time for them to go. It was 75 miles from Bethlehem to the border between Israel and Egypt, and another 100 miles from the border of Egypt to Alexandria, to the place that they will land. This is where all of the fanciful tales about Mary being on a donkey comes from. Now, you can see that the text doesn't actually include that, but it was 175 miles. She just had a baby. You know the dad's not going to be helpful in carrying anything, so we have to have a camel or a donkey or something that's going to help along the travel. So it's not unreasonable to think that something helped them travel from Bethlehem to the 175 miles. But why Egypt? The last time these Israelites were in Egypt, they were there in captivity. Moses had to get them out. So why go back there? I told you this before. There's this miraculous thing that happens in the Bible between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. We call it the intertestamental period, in between the testaments. During that time, the Greek Empire is reigning and ruling, and the greatest ruler maybe we've ever seen, the son of Philip II, Alexander from Greece, is now reigning over most of the known world. The problem is that he's from a very insignificant province in Greece called Macedonia. Macedonia was constantly being conquered and turned into slaves and being abused. And so one of the things that Alexander wanted to do was he wanted to make it safe that even after his own reign, the people of Macedonia could find refuge. And so he goes to Egypt, and after conquering them, he establishes a small province in the middle of it where the Macedonian Greek people could come and find refuge if they were being turned into slaves or being mistreated. The problem is that none of the people in Macedonia knew how to build anything. Well, there were still rumors in Egypt of 1,000 years before, when the people of Israel were held in captivity, and they built this great empire as slaves. And so Alexander goes to Israel and he makes a deal, and he says, "Listen, if you'll help me build this city, then there'll never be a time in the history of Alexandria, of Egypt, that your people won't have refuge here. Like the Macedonians from Greece would have refuge, the Israelites who helped build the city. As a matter of fact, they helped build the city, and then almost immediately this thing called the Maccabean revolt happens, and thousands upon thousands of the greatest leaders in Israel have to flee to Egypt, and they end up in Alexandria. So if you are a Jew growing up in Bethlehem, and you know that there is a threat against the life of your newborn child, where can you go that the hand of Rome, the hand of Herod the Great can't reach? The one place that had been established in Egypt to give refuge to the Jews, Alexandria. But it's 175 miles and you're a poor family with a new baby. How in the world are you going to travel that far unless kingmakers from the Orient come and they bring you gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh? Enough that appears to have provided for them for several years while they were there. If you were going to claim to be the king of Israel, you had to be from Bethlehem and you had to be out of Egypt. The text continues in verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they were no more. As a side note, for skeptics in the room about whether or not this could really be true. Up until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, about 40 years after the time that Jesus is crucified, the last temple was destroyed. Up until then, from the time of Abraham, when he left Ur of the Chaldees and moved to the Promised Land, until 70 AD, there was almost an unbreakable genealogical record. Now, why was this important? Because if you were going to claim to be an Israelite, it wasn't just being a part of a descended group. It was you had a rightful heir of a part of the land. And so keeping genealogical records was essential to knowing who would inherit the land, who the land belonged to, which tribe you were from. And so for thousands of years, up until 70 AD, there's a genealogical record of every person that was a part of the tribes of Israel. If you go back and look, about 70 years before the history of the temple's destroyed, if you go and look, you'll notice that there's a gap in there where the population of Israel drops significantly. Significantly. Families go from having approximately 2 children a year to having 1 child a year over a 3-year period. What could have happened uniquely in human history that would have caused the population growth rate to drop so significantly just in that period? It's almost like in human history, someone eliminated 1 child from every family. And that's what Herod does. He eliminates 1 child, the oldest firstborn, from every family in that 2-year period. And what happens is it says that like Rachel, the mother of Israel, from the book of Genesis, there will be weeping and lamentations in Ramah. Ramah is a really interesting geographical location. If you remember, during David's reign, because of his sin, the kingdom begins to fracture. And then by the time his family takes over, there's a northern and a southern kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. But there's a buffer zone land in between the 2 great kingdoms. There's an area where they could meet with family that had been divided because they were in different tribes. There were places that treaties could be negotiated. There was a place that was unclaimed by either kingdom that any people from the northern or the southern kingdom could come and find refuge and find training and find reconnection with family. And that area was called Ramah. And even while the northern and the southern kingdom were being destroyed by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians, Ramah remained a place of peace, a place that was virtually untouched for 1,000 years. And how are you going to know that the Messiah has come? There will be weeping in Ramah. A place of peace, there will be weeping. And why is there weeping there? Because Herod doesn't care at all that you're in the land of peace. He just wants every firstborn in all of Israel, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, and Ramah, to be destroyed. And so he begins murdering babies even in this small province in between the lands. And when that weeping comes because of the persecution of Herod, it's one of the marks that the Messiah has arrived. For over 1,000 years, there's been peace in Ramah. And when there's weeping there, when there's lamentation there, when the Messiah comes out of Egypt and when he's found in Bethlehem, you'll know that this is the rightful heir to David's throne. And then the final location, Nazareth. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and he took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And behold, being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and he lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. So Joseph is told that it's time to leave Egypt and go back to Israel. It would have been his instinct to go back to Bethlehem. But he learns that actually Herod has died, but his son, Archelaus, has now become the king. And he's a terrible guy. Do not let your children Wikipedia this guy. Bad guy. Like, put him on the list with the Hitlers and the Mussolinis of the world, right? Terrible, burning Christians alive, dragging them through the streets, bad guy. And so he's so bad, as a matter of fact, that Rome comes in and removes him from office. Do you know how bad you have to be that Rome's like, nah, you're too bad for us. We have to remove you from office. As a matter of fact, they remove him from office, and you know who they put in place? Pontius Pilate, who's the man that will one day wash his hands of Jesus. So this guy's reigning, so they have to go to a place that no one would ever believe the Messiah has come from, Nazareth. Of all of the things that make Jesus an unlikely Messiah, coming from Nazareth might be among the greatest unpredictable indicators. Nazareth was a slur. It was used as a way to insult people. As a matter of fact, in the book of Acts, chapter 24, they're trying to disqualify Paul from being an apostle. And you know what they say of him? For we have found this man is a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes. How do they try to disqualify Paul? Call him a man from Nazareth. What does Nathanael in the New Testament say? Nothing good can come from Nazareth. So Jesus, fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy, comes from Nazareth. These four cities commingled together are a part of an unpredictable cocktail mix of what it means to be the rightful heir of Israel's throne. You see that it's possible that one person could come from Bethlehem. King David had. It's possible that one person could come from Bethlehem and have fled to Egypt. But when you begin to stack just these four cities on top of each other, you begin to realize how improbable it is that any person in human history could fulfill just 4 or maybe 8, but no way 320. And so what we have here in Matthew is insight into how profound God's work in human history is. From a city like 1,000 other cities in Bethlehem, he would come. And then because of the hatred of Herod the Great, he would flee to Egypt and find refuge in Alexander's town, preserved only for the Macedonians and the Israelites. And then Herod's hatred would drive him so insane, he would begin to kill the firstborn of any family born in that 2-year period, so much so that it changes the population graphs in human history. And he doesn't care if you're from the northern or southern kingdom. He'll kill you wherever you live. And so there's weeping in Ramah. And then he dies, and his far worse son becomes in charge. And so now we have to go to Nazareth, where no good thing can come from Nazareth. God leaves no doubt that he writes history. Thousands of years and hundreds of years and days before the arrival of Jesus, he's orchestrating human history so that no one can miss that Jesus is exactly who he claims to be. There is a fanciful thought among skeptics of Christianity that suggests that we have made Jesus into someone that Jesus himself doesn't think he is. Remember when in the Gospel of John they asked Jesus who he is 7 times. He says, I am. I am is the same label that God calls himself when Moses asked him who's speaking to him from that bush. Tell them that I am sent you. But there's part of the Christmas story that's always bothered me. I mean, I love the Christmas cards and we're festive and I love Christmas. But there's something about the nature of the way that I experience Christmas as a father and as a son and as a husband that echoes in this story. You get up on Christmas morning. We homeschool our kids so they sleep in. So our Christmas day started around 10:30. For all of you who got up at 6 a.m., there is another way, I promise you. Our children know better than to wake us up on Christmas morning, but we go in and then it's a tornado of paper and glitter, as I like to call devil dust, everywhere in the house. We didn't get our tree up quickly enough, so now every time I walk by in the house, I start the Charlie Brown Christmas song because all the needles have fallen off our tree. It's now just a big stick of kindling in the middle of my living room. It's going to the driveway today. And there's something that the buildup of the excitement of Christmas can never actually be met by the event itself. And then here I am, the dad, dragging that big black trash bag through the living room, trying to convince my wife that we don't actually have to keep tissue paper. It's not that expensive. We can just buy it again next year. It's the disappointment of the day after. Think about what it was like for these people who for generations and thousands of years have been waiting for this time in which the Messiah would come. The arrival of the Christ child, shouted forth into the darkness by the multitude of angels, ushered into humanity by the unassuming teenage shepherds, anointed as king by the kingmakers of the Orient, fulfilling all of the prophecies of geography and identification that would assure the world that Jesus was the rightful heir to David's throne. We've been waiting for this Christmas day. And then he just leaves. He's born in obscurity in Bethlehem. He then goes to Egypt for several years and then spends most of his adult life in Nazareth, in the province of Galilee. No one even knew he was there. We waited for thousands of years, and now we have to wait for 3 more decades until he comes and meets John the Baptist at the Jordan River. You talk about disappointment of the day after. What was it like for all these people who knew the Messiah was there and yet had not benefited in any way from his arrival? They waited. They just waited. Some of the hardest parts about walking with Jesus is the waiting. It's the waiting for our time, for our prayer to be answered, for our marriage to be healed. It's waiting for the right time when God is going to respond to the prayer that we've been pleading. How is it that we handle the disappointment of the day after? I think the Lord over these weeks have been teaching me a few lessons. The first principle that I've kept in mind is that God's writing of history is never unintentional. My goodness, if I look back at my own life and all the times that I was impatient, that I was frustrated, that I was skeptical that God even heard me, and then I look back and see the ways that God was faithful to me, there are so many times that I am glad that God didn't respond to my urgency because his timing was best. There are so many times that I'm glad that God wasn't moved by my frustrations, by my uncertainty, by my skepticism that I was even being heard. Because as I look back at my own story over 45 years, I see all the times that God knew best. Do you know what it takes to orchestrate Bethlehem and Egypt and Ramah and Nazareth? Imagine what it took for him to orchestrate it so that all 320 prophecies are fulfilled in one baby. Nothing about the way in which God writes history is unintentional. We only see our history looking backwards. And I'm so glad that God doesn't let me see tomorrow, because today has enough worries of its own. But I'm also equally glad that he does see tomorrow. And not only is he at work in my past, bringing me to here, but he's also orchestrating all things in the future for his glory and my good. The second principle that I've learned over these last weeks is that don't blame God, but find God in your story. Don't blame God, but find God in your story. 2014, I heard a sermon in Louisville, Kentucky from a pastor named Chris Osborne. And Chris Osborne started his sermon that day. What a great name, Chris Osborne. He started his sermon that day by saying, Jesus ran off all the people who liked him. Jesus ran off all the people who liked him because he didn't want people who liked him. He wanted people who would follow him. Jesus wasn't interested in fans. He was interested in devotees. And it really has shaped over the last decade the way I think about my own relationship with Jesus. I have been thoroughly churched my entire life. There's been no season in my 45 years of existence that I have not been deeply involved in a local church. It is very, very possible that I have missed less than 50 Sundays in 45 years of church. My dad didn't miss church. We were the cool family. We went to church on vacation. And now I worked for churches since 1999. And so I've just not missed a whole lot of church in my entire life. And some of those church experiences have been fantastic, and some of them have been less than fantastic. And I've seen people in my own life that have walked away from church because of the ways in which the church has either treated them or other people. And so I want to be very careful in saying, I am well aware that many of us have hurt that was caused by the church. But I also want you to hear me say that it was the church that hurt you, not Jesus. Jesus has never hurt you. Jesus has never betrayed you. And so while there's an instinct to blame God for the inaction, the waiting, because we make sometimes our disappointment in God synonymous with God's people, the truth is that there's never been a time in your life that God didn't do what was absolutely best for you. There's never been a time in your life that God hurt you or disappointed you. So because of that, in the waiting, in the disappointment of the day after, as we wait for what God has for us next, don't blame God. Find God in your story. And the third piece is this. The third principle, don't build your life on your promises to God. I feel like that most of my Christian life, I spent all of my energy trying to make promises to God that would in turn into him blessing me. God, if I do this, then you'll do this for me. And some of that is trivial stuff, like standing on the free throw line in a basketball game and saying, Lord, if you'll help me make these 2 free throws, I'll never miss church again, right? Those kinds of things. To other things like, God, if you'll just help me find the right spouse, or if you'll just heal my body, or if you'll just help me love my job, or if you'll just bring my wayward child home, then God, when you do that, I promise I will be faithful, be a better giver, be a better husband, be a better follower. And the truth is that in living in that tension of if I do this, God will respond this way, we have turned our relationship with the creator of the universe into an entirely transactional relationship. Meaning, I will get as good as I give. There is no part of me that when I'm being my most honest, that wants anything close to what I'm able to give. So that's why you begin to see that the Christian life is not built on our commitment to God, but instead God's commitment to us. Let me draw your attention to 2 places that assure you of that. One is, we love God because, John says, he first loved us. Our affection for God is not based on anything other than we have first experienced God's affection for us. But one of the foundational texts of this church, of the preaching of Pastor Alan Wright, and of what we do, and one of the reasons that we will host the blessing service on January the 12th is because we believe this unbelievably obscure text in Hebrews 12 might be among the more profound scriptures in all the New Testament. It says, when God was looking for someone by whom he could confirm his promises, he could find no one worthy. And so that says that God confirmed his promises by the only thing he knew to be true. God swore an oath to himself. God swears to God. Meaning, God's affection towards you isn't built on your obedience, isn't built on how good you are, isn't built on how faithful you are. As a matter of fact, God tried to find in all of us something worthy that he could base his promises on. And in finding nothing worthy that he could tie his promises to, he tied them to the only thing he knew to be true, and that was his own character. It is at least an opportunity as we move into the new year to think about goal setting and how to lose weight and be a more faithful scripture reader and all of the things. And all of those things are great. Like, it is a good time to calculate what are the priorities of how you want to use your time and your treasure and your talent in a new year. But please do not do any of the goal setting, any of the recalculation for 2025 with the hope that if you keep those goals, God will bless you. The promise of Scripture is that when you weren't worthy of being blessed, God chose to bless you anyway. Every other religion on earth says, do as much as you can do and trust whatever God looks like for them to do the rest. Christianity says, whatever you do is filthy rags to God. It's sin tainted by your disobedience. So the good news of Christianity is we're all bozos on the bus. We're all broken. We've all fallen short. And yet God loved us anyway. How do we handle the disappointment of the day after that might be marked by the symbolism of wrapping paper on a floor and the resetting of a clock for next Christmas Day? but really is a marking of everything about our lives. However happy we are in any of the spheres of our lives, our marriage, our finances, our parenting, our friendships, our vocational identity, no matter how happy we are in those major categories of life, all of us wish all of those things were a little better. All of us wish that our marriage and our kids and our finances and our vocational identity and our relationship with friends and family, we all wish that no matter how healthy they are, we all wish they were a little better. And our instinct is to say, if I was better, those things would be better. But the Christian life is fueled by the promise that in our disappointment, in our waiting, we understand that 2,000 years ago, when the world was waiting for Messiah, when the world was longing for a new king, Jesus came and he lived a life that we could never live in perfect obedience to the Father. And then he died the death that was rightfully ours. In our place, for our sin, condemned he stood. And then 3 days later, because sin and death and all the schemes of hell can make no claim on the perfect Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, Jesus was raised from the dead. And from that point forward, every single person in human history who put their faith in the resurrection of Jesus and his lordship, his kingship in their life, every single person could do nothing to lose the favor they didn't earn, and never again had to question whether or not God had turned his affection towards them. The waiting is the hardest. It's easy to be a follower of Jesus when I can mark his faithfulness and his favor. The hardest part is the waiting when I can't see those things. When my kids are being foolish and my marriage is being hard and my finances are being tight, and my goodness, I do not want to go to work tomorrow. I do, but the rest of you don't like your jobs. But here's what I know. As much as Jesus is present in my celebration and joy, Jesus is present in my disappointment and waiting. So enter into this new year knowing Jesus is already there. He's already preparing a place. Maybe it's Bethlehem, maybe it's Egypt, maybe it's Ramah, maybe it's Nazareth. But Jesus is already there because he wants you to leave and lead in this world with two things that you never question. One is how much he loves you, and two is how much he has a plan for you. And that's the gospel.